Welcome to lab number 16, which is our first lab about the nervous system. And appropriately, we can see a brain right here. We've got a sagittal slice of the cranium. We're looking inside the cranial cavity, and we see this lovely brain right here. That's a horrible outline of the brain, but you get the idea. You can see that brain in there. We have the brain in the cranial cavity because it is a very protected place. There are lovely cranial bones, 8 of them that you learned about in the last unit, all protecting this brain. Now, not only do bones protect the brain, there are other things as well. There are a set of membranes protecting the brain. The membranes are known as the meninges. There are 3 meninges. They are the Dura matter, the arachnoid matter, and the pia matter. When we look at models, we're only going to see one of these meninges, okay? The only meninx, the singular of meninges is meninx. The only meninx we're going to see is the Dura matter. It actually has 2 layers that we can see here. Layer number 1 is that white line right there. Layer number 2 is that white line right there. More about them in a moment. So we're going to see the Dura matter. We're not going to see the other 2, but we're going to be aware of their existence. Hey, by the way, notice if you spell this backward, it spells the word pad. P-A-D. The meninges pad the brain. If you had to guess from their names, which one do you think is the thickest, toughest, and strongest? What if I asked you which one is the most durable? Of course, you would say the Dura matter, and that's the right idea. All right, more on the Dura matter in a moment. There is also a thin layer of fluid that's going to protect the brain. The thin layer of fluid is actually found between these 2 layers, between the arachnoid and the pia. There's a space in there called the subarachnoid space, which we're not going to see, but again, we're going to know that it exists, and that space is occupied by cerebrospinal fluid. All right. Excellent start to today. Let's look at the same picture for a moment, and we can see these 2 layers of the Dura matter. Now, when we're talking about the Dura matter around the brain, we use the word cranial in front of it. So we say cranial Dura matter. If we were talking about it around the spinal cord, we would say spinal Dura matter. Okay? Now, the 2 layers here, there's an outer one which the green arrow is touching, and an inner one which the red arrow is touching. The outer one, the more superficial one, is the green arrow here, and it is called the periosteal layer because it is going to be up against the cranial bones. Now, the deeper one, the red arrow here, is the meningeal layer because it will be up against the other meninges. Now, both these layers are tough and strong, and if we were actually in the lab, when we cut up sheep brains in the lab, you can try and tear the Dura matter. You can pull on it and see just how gosh darn strong it is. Now, the Dura matter is really strong because it's dense, irregular connective tissue. And you know that that dense word right there means it is ridiculously chock full of collagen, which of course is strong. Now, I do want you to notice that in between the 2 layers there is a blood vessel. It is known as a dural venous sinus, and that blood vessel is actually going to receive like old cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the 2 layers are not always apart. Most of the time they're actually smack right up against one another, but occasionally they're apart, and there are blood vessels in there which will receive the CSF. All right. That is basically it for the meninges for the time being. So let's talk brains. Here is a beautiful brain model. Lateral view of it, of course. And there are 4 regions we're going to go over. The cerebrum, which literally means brain. the cerebellum, which means little brain, the diencephalon, which means second in the head, and then last but not least, the brain stem. You can kind of figure out why the brain stem is called the brain stem. So let's outline these four regions here, starting with the cerebrum outlined in blue. It has a bunch of functions. Conscious thought, motor control, so moving your body parts, sensory processing, so being aware of touch, temperature, pain, vision, hearing, taste, smells, and a whole lot more. Now, the brain is not smooth. You do not have a smooth brain. You have a wrinkled brain. The wrinkles have names. So the ridges, a ridge, like this ridge right here, would be called a gyrus. The word gyrus means twist because the ridges are not straight, but they do meander a bit. And then the grooves in between the ridges, the grooves, are called sulci. One is a sulcus, many are sulci. One gyrus, many gyri. Now, the presence of these folds are going to maximize our surface area. If we have more surface area, we can have more neurons. More neurons make us more smarter. So you get more smarter with more neurons. You get more neurons and more surface area. And you get more surface area with more folds, more gyri and sulci. All right, so that is the cerebrum. We are going to come back to it later. Don't worry. Here we see the two halves of the cerebrum, in fact. So when I said we're going to come back to it, I mean almost immediately. Each of these halves of the cerebrum is a cerebral hemisphere. And there is a deep groove separating them called the longitudinal fissure, which the red arrow, of course, is indicating. Now, in this view, we see a portion of the cerebellum. The cerebrum is hiding a little bit of the cerebellum as well. And the cerebellum is going to primarily function in motor control, help with things like your sense of balance and coordination, but it does play a role in a lot of cognitive areas as well. And more on it later. Now, here we see a chunk of the brainstem. Notice I skipped that other one I mentioned earlier, the diencephalon, because we cannot see the diencephalon in a lateral view of the brain. It is a deeper structure. But I can see part of the brainstem, which of course connects the rest of the brain to the spinal cord. It's going to be involved in a lot of very basic functions, a lot of homeostatic functions, maintaining your heart rate, your respiratory rate, and many, many, many more. Okay, we are now going to do some cerebrum. And the cerebrum is divided into 5 separate lobes. 5 separate lobes. Right here, this lobe that's very anterior is the frontal lobe. It is, of course, protected by the frontal bone, frontal lobe. It has multiple functions: thinking or cognition, behavior, personality, sense of humor, motor control, lots of good functions. This is actually the last lobe of your cerebrum to develop fully, which does not occur until you are well into your 20s. So your frontal lobe isn't fully developed until you are in your 20s generally. Now, you cannot use that as an excuse on an exam. If you are like under 24, you cannot say, hey, Imholtz, I know I didn't do so great in that exam, but you got to cut me a break because, hey, I'm only 18 and my frontal lobe is not fully developed. So, yeah, give me a better grade. Can't do that. Won't work. Will not work. All right, that is lobe number 1. Lobe number 1 of 5. Lobe number 2 is the parietal lobe. Of course, situated near the parietal bone. The parietal lobe is very much involved in your somatosensation. Now remember, somato means body, right? Like soma. And Somatosensation is your sense of your body, so awareness of things touching your body, awareness of your body's position, your limb and joints, what they're doing in space, and that sense is called proprioception, which we have met that word already. Not a new word. A wonderful word, but not a new one. Okay. Let's keep on going. And what lobe is next? No lobe is next. We have a sulcus. There is a special sulcus that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. That special sulcus, you can see how people have drawn in it quite a bit here. That special sulcus, purple arrow, is called the central sulcus. It is a wonderful landmark because if you can find it, anterior to it is the frontal lobe. Posterior to it is the parietal lobe. And, in fact, there's even more. The ridge in front of the central sulcus is known as the precentral gyrus. Now, of course, this means it sits right in front of the central sulcus. It is your primary motor cortex. What does that mean? That means it is the place that controls your body's movements. And it exhibits contralateral control, which means that if you were to be using this particular precentral gyrus, this guy right here, which is in the left hemisphere, you would be controlling movements in the right side of the body. Contralateral control, opposite side control. All right, wonderful. Now, if we have a precentral gyrus, what else do you suppose we have? And I think you guessed it, a postcentral gyrus. Postcentral gyrus just behind, just posterior to the central sulcus. So there's my sulcus, and there's my postcentral gyrus. This is your primary somatosensory cortex. Primary somatosensory cortex. Somatosensory, body sensation, touch, proprioception, right? This guy is going to get contralateral input as well. So if you were to pinch your left arm, you would feel that pinching in your right postcentral gyrus. And of course, the postcentral gyrus is part of our parietal lobe. All right. Now, we're onward to another lobe, the most posteriorist lobe of them all, the occipital lobe. You probably could have guessed that name with the theme we have going on here. And it is primarily involved in the sense of vision. A very important sense, I think you would agree. All right, 2 more lobes to go. Whoops, I went a little fast there. The next lobe, this guy outlined in blue here, is the temporal lobe. Very much involved in your sensation of hearing, of auditory interpretation and information. There is a very lovely groove separating the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal ones, and that groove is called the lateral sulcus. Sometimes referred to as the lateral fissure, sometimes lateral sulcus, but it is very lovely and very visible right there. I want you to imagine you stick your fingers into the lateral sulcus and you kind of pull it back. If you were to do such a thing, you would expose the hidden 5th lobe of the brain, which is called the insula. Insula means island, because it is tucked away, separate from the other lobes, with its deep positioning here. It is involved in a lot of emotional states, consciousness, as well as your sensation of taste. Okay, let's clear all this, and let us continue by slicing the brain transversely. So we took off the top portion of the cerebrum, just so we could see a couple things inside it. We can still see the insula here. Here's the temporal lobe over here. Now, what I also want you to notice is this cavity here. And we mentioned this in the first nervous system lecture. The brain has cavities, and this cavity is one of the 4 ventricles of the brain. There are 4 ventricles. This is a cerebral ventricle because what are we in here? We're in the cerebrum. The ventricles are going to contain these networks of blood vessels that make cerebrospinal fluid, and the ventricle here would be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. This is a lateral ventricle. There's one lateral ventricle on each side of the brain in each cerebral hemisphere, hence lateral ventricle. The other 2 ventricles will meet later. They are much more medial, as we shall see. All right, there's other stuff we can see here. As we look at this cerebrum here, getting a little ahead of myself, if we look at this cerebrum here, we can see there's an outer layer to the cerebrum, a superficial layer, as well as a deeper layer. The outer layer is known as the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex. The word cortex means bark, like bark of a tree, not like bark of a dog, okay? And, hey, bark is on the outside and wrinkly too. Now, the cerebral cortex is composed of gray matter. Gray matter is nervous tissue where you're going to find somata, so cell bodies, dendrites, and some unmyelinated axons. The overall function of gray matter is integration, which we know is the processing of information. All right, if this layer out here is gray matter, any idea what this deeper region is going to be called? Shout out a guess if you got one. And maybe you said white matter, and you'd be right. The white matter in the cerebrum, which is the deeper part, is composed of myelinated axons. And of course, myelinated axons send signals. They send signals quickly, and they allow different areas of the brain to talk to one another. All right. Wonderful. Let's keep going. Got another piece of white matter to check out here. So we've switched the slicing of the brain. This is a beautiful mid-sagittal slice, and I can see the cerebrum still. I mean, this is all cerebrum right here. And what this white thing is with all the tens on it, that thing right there is a tract of white matter. Now, the word tract means a big bundle of axons in the CNS. So a tract is a big bundle of axons in the CNS, and a nerve is a big bundle of axons in the PNS. So central versus peripheral nervous systems there. And this particular tract is one of the few tracts that we have to know the name of. It is called the corpus callosum. It is going to connect the 2 cerebral hemispheres, connect the right and the left. And corpus means body, like the word corpse, right? Callosum means hard, like callus. And so literally it's the hard body, because it's actually pretty tough. It's hard to tear. If you ever held a human brain in your hand and tried to tear the corpus callosum, you would be amazed at its strength. Okay? Good stuff. Good stuff. And what I see here is something underneath the corpus callosum that I just cannot help but point out. This pinkish thing right here is called a choroid plexus. Choroid means colorful, plexus means net. And this is it's like a network, a branching collection of blood vessels, little blood vessels called capillaries. And it is definitely colorful compared to the rest of the brain tissue. The blood vessels stand out, hence choroid. And it is rather tangly, hence plexus, which means net. The choroid plexus is the place where cerebrospinal fluid is made. And in fact, every single ventricle is going to contain a choroid plexus. So there are 4 ventricles and there are four choroid plexuses. This choroid plexus is associated with the third ventricle, which we're going to save for later. But since we see it now, and because it's so close to the corpus callosum that they have that relationship, I couldn't not point it out. I had to do it. All right, onward. Also near the corpus callosum, near the front part of it, is this guy right here with the number 11 on it. He is actually a very skinny membrane called the septum pellucidum. Septum means like a wall, like separating, of course. Pellucidum means clear, because in the real brain, this wall is flimsy. It's not quite clear, but it's getting there. It's kind of translucent, so it's getting there. And actually, if we were to poke, like, imagine sticking your finger straight into your screen where that number 11 is. Just poke your finger right through that screen, not too hard. And if you went through that 11, you would end up in the left lateral ventricle. So the septum pellucidum actually separates the lateral ventricle on the left from the lateral ventricle on the right. And you would poke through it if you went right through right there. Okay, another neighboring structure is another tract of white matter right here. It is called the fornix. The fornix, the word fornix means like an arch. Like you think about classical architecture, like ancient Rome, ancient Greece, the archways and buildings. Such an archway would be called a fornix. And what it is going to do is connect your cerebral hemisphere bits and pieces to parts of your diencephalon. The diencephalon is actually right here. Okay? So you can see the fornix is right here, the 12 on it. The fornix connects the diencephalon to the cerebrum. We haven't really talked about the diencephalon at all, except telling you that it exists. And earlier I said you couldn't see it in the outside view of the brain, but now you can see it in this slice. And it is on our menu for today. All right, let's clear all that, and let's keep on going. Let's move on to that course. The diencephalon. It is that structure within that greenish line right there, that diencephalon. It's not huge. Diencephalon means second in the head, in the skull. Because when your nervous system was really, really, really young, so you were like just this embryonic thing, at first your nervous system looks like just a tube. And then that tube starts to swell, and that tube gets some swellings. I don't want to draw too many. I haven't taken embryology in a long time. So the tube gets these swellings, and that second swelling in there becomes the diencephalon. Okay, anywho, let's keep on going. The diencephalon, it is very much involved in homeostatic things. So you think about temperature of your body. It's like the classic example of a homeostatic thing. And the diencephalon is involved in that. And we'll see that there's more than just temperature, lots of homeostatic functions. The diencephalon is also involved in filtering out unnecessary sensory input. And we'll see what we mean by that as well. Okay, let's keep on going. So the biggest part of the diencephalon is this thing called the thalamus. And remember, we're looking at half of a brain here. So I see one side of the thalamus right here. One side of the thalamus in that oval right there. It is an egg-shaped and ovoid structure. So it's not just the surface here. It's also going towards the left here. It's going deep. So it's not just this like surface that we see here, but it's to the lateral to this too. And the thalamus is going to primarily function as a sensory filter that actually stops most sensory signals from reaching your cerebrum. Now, if you think about it, you are inundated by sensory signals all the time. I mean, think about it. You have sensory receptors in every joint, in all your muscles, throughout your skin. Not to mention the normal senses we think of is like taste, hearing, vision, etc. Most of those senses are not, you're not aware of them, right? I mean, you're not usually aware of the pressure your watch is putting on your wrist. You're not usually aware of the position of your elbow because your thalamus is filtering these signals out so that just important or new signals are allowed through, which is kind of necessary when you think about it. All right, let's keep on going. There is a little brown chunk right here called the interthalamic adhesion. As its name suggests, it sticks the two halves of the thalamus together, hence the word adhesion. It's like the sticky thing between the two halves of the thalamus. It's going to connect the left part, which we see a bit of right here, to the right part of the thalamus. Okay, now just kind of anterior and inferior to the thalamus is the hypothalamus right there. It's a tiny little thing, but it does jobs that are very important. It is really involved in homeostasis. It's the part of the diencephalon involved in thermoregulation, so maintaining your temperature, as well as hunger, satiety, so like your sense of fullness, of satisfaction with your food, thirst, hormone release, blood pressure, heart rate. Plus, it's involved in memory, learning, and wakefulness. If we were in an actual class, I would make a joke right now about wakefulness and how some of you be falling asleep in lecture. All right, let's keep going. Okay, what I want you to do is to take your two hands and see if you can. I'm terrible at drawing hands, but I'm going to try and draw your hand here. Okay, this is one of your hands. There's one of your hands right there. Okay, that's your left hand right there, okay? Is that the worst left hand you've ever seen? Maybe not, right? Maybe not. Maybe it is, I don't know. Maybe it is. Dun, dun, dun. And this is your right hand. Dun, dun, dun. All right. And let's give you some wrists. Let's give you some wrists. There's your wrist. Let's give you another wrist on this side. So you're going to make this shape with your hands. There's your watch right there. Your nice Apple Watch. Looks good. All right. So there, make this shape with your two hands, okay? And this space right here, leave a little space between them, okay? Leave a little space between your hands. So you go like this, and there's this little space between your hands, right? And now I want you to separate your hands and just look at one of them. Can you still see that space? Like if you just hold one of your hands, can you still see that space? No, but you can kind of imagine it. And that's what we got going on right here. There is space between this wall, where I'm putting a bunch of blue dots. There is space between this wall on the left and space and the wall, the corresponding wall on the right. So there is space between this wall where my blue dots are on the left and the corresponding wall on the right. And that space is called the third ventricle. Remember we had a pair of lateral ventricles before in the cerebrum? The third ventricle is in the diencephalon. It is definitely right in the middle of it, so it's very medial as compared to the lateral ventricles we met earlier. So this space here, the arrow is kind of pointing at it, it's just kind of hard to imagine. This space here is the third ventricle. And earlier we mentioned that we saw the choroid plexus that was associated with it right there. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for bearing with me in that artistic demonstration. Now, if we go back and we find that hypothalamus, which is right here, beautiful hypothalamus, just kind of in front of the hypothalamus, this white structure right here is a thing called the optic chiasm. I bring it up now because it is a great landmark for the hypothalamus. You find that optic chiasm, and then that hypothalamus is that area right near it, right there. And the optic chiasm is, as its name suggests, you got the word optic in there, right? It is very much involved in your visual pathway from your retinas to your brain. And so we're going to come back to it actually, I think, in the next lab that we're doing. But I wanted to mention it now because it's such a good landmark. All right. Now, just along that same vein, along that same idea, connected to the optic chiasm, we see one of the optic nerves here. This is the left optic nerve. Remember, a nerve is a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system, so outside the brain, outside the cord. And we've actually left the brain here. This optic nerve is going to extend from the retina of the left eye. It's going to pass through the left optic canal of the sphenoid bone and is going to come into the optic chiasm here. Again, just important landmarks that we do want to be aware of. All right. Sitting kind of below the hypothalamus is a structure called the mammillary body. The mammillary body. And it is very much involved in your sense of smell. It is involved in episodic memory. So kind of like remembering a whole sequence of events. It's also it ties in with emotions as well. Okay, so that is the mammillary body. There's actually two of them. We see the left one right here. All right. We're almost done, folks. Almost done. A little over half an hour. Not bad. And in this last model, I actually had to switch models because the other one did not have it. This model shows us something attached to our hypothalamus. So here is our hypothalamus right here. Right there. And coming down the hypothalamus, we got this whitish guy right here. That is called the infundibulum, which means funnel. Well, I don't really know how much of a funnel it actually looks like. The infundibulum connects this gland right here. This gland is called the pituitary gland, and it connects it to the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland is going to be an endocrine gland, so it's going to make hormones. The front half of it is going to secrete hormones such as follicle stimulating hormone, which is going to be involved in ovarian function in females, as well as testicular function in males. It also releases something called prolactin, which is very important, as its name suggests, for milk production, as well as growth hormone, which we met growth hormone when we were talking about bones. The posterior pituitary, so the back half of the pituitary, is going to make hormones produced actually by cells in the hypothalamus, whose axons then come down the infundibulum. And the hormones made by the released by the posterior pituitary include oxytocin, which you may remember is that positive feedback hormone involved in childbirth, as well as a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, which, as its name tells us, stops you from peeing. All right, so we see that beautiful pituitary gland and its infundibulum there, and we should be aware of some of the hormones as well. Now, lastly, I suggest you pause this video right here in a moment and you find all of these things. Okay, on that note, we are done with lab number 16. It's been fun, and I will see you guys next time around. Bye-bye.